This is going to be the first lecture for Chapter 4. This chapter goes over arousal, stress, and anxiety. So in our last lecture we started to talk about PSTs in Chapter 11. Now we're going to actually delve into the individual maybe topics and areas where sports psych consultants are going to work with athletes. So the first one we're going to talk about, again, is arousal, stress, and anxiety. These are extremely important for performance in physical activity. I will say off the bat, though, we do have to get the giggles out. So arousal, we're going to be talking about psychological arousal, so I'll be saying that a lot. So go ahead, giggle amongst yourselves, but when you're ready, we're going to move forward. Okay, so here we go. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is really the difference, or is there a difference between arousal and anxiety? We're going to come back to stress in a moment, so don't worry about that. Now when we think of arousal, what I want you to think of is kind of this blend or a mixture between physiological and psychological activity of the person. So the way I like to conceptualize this is how amped up is a person? How highly activated are they? As opposed to anxiety, which is quite different. It's more of a negative emotional state, and we tend to associate it with things like nervousness, worry, apprehension, those kind of elements. And it's important to note that these are different. Just because you're highly activated does not mean you have a lot of anxiety. Okay, and that's because there's two different types of anxiety that we should discuss. So there's trait anxiety and state anxiety. Trait anxiety is, think of that as more of a predisposition of a person. It's kind of our baseline. It's who we, individuals, athletes, whoever we're talking about, it's kind of their baseline anxiety level. So someone who has a high trait anxiety is someone who's an anxious person overall. Whereas if we think of state anxiety, that's more situation to situation, and it might change because of the demands of the activity that we're engaging in or the environment that we're situated in. Okay, and this figure kind of talks to that, and this is in your book. So on the left we have trait anxiety, and it kind of gives you an idea of what that is. But then when we start talking about state anxiety, again, these are more moment-to-moment incidences. This is where arousal is really going to take hold. Because you can see that maybe if someone is very amped up, very psyched up for an event, that might change their anxiety level on a moment-to-moment basis. And we can even break that down, that state anxiety, even further into a cognitive state anxiety and a somatic state anxiety. And the cognitive side is really thinking about negative thoughts and worries, and it might change moment to moment. But then also we have this element of somatic state anxiety, and that's these moment-to-moment changes again in perceived physiological arousal and how we're feeling physically. Now, while it's important to note that there's different types of arousal and anxiety, and this relationship can be different, we also need to note how we measure these things. And there's definitely some physiological signs, so you can think of a lot of times when someone's really hyped up or amped up, their heart rate's going to be high, their breathing's going to be a bit faster. We can look at their skin conductance. There's some biochemistry. So there's a lot of different elements we can look at, okay, on more of a physiological level. But there's also the psych side of things, and for that we have global and what we call multidimensional self-report scales. So what these get at are when we say global, that just means it covers a lot of different things, maybe not just physical activity, but it might be sport specific or even task specific within a sport. And when we say multidimensional, that's when we're talking about different dimensions of physical activity. Now some examples, and it's got some in the textbook, it actually has some actual example items from a few of these measures. There's the CSAI-2, which is the Competitive State Anxiety Inventory 2. It's just the second version. And then there's one like the SAS, which is a sport anxiety test. The SCAT is another one. The CSAI2 is actually a state inventory. So again, this is going to be the one that looks at you more thing to thing or moment to moment, excuse me. Whereas the latter two are really going to look at more of a trait or dispositional anxiety levels. Now we need to start talking about the stress component, because stress also plays an influence on anxiety. And you can think of arousal also kind of all working together. Now stress, we can define it as a substantial imbalance between a physical and psychological demands placed on an individual and his or her response capability under conditions in which failure to meet demands has important consequences. Now that's a mouthful. Really think of stress as something that goes on in your environment that demands some kind of response from you. And we can think about this in sense of coping. If we're in a track meet, we can think of something stressful as, I don't know, maybe the crowd that's there or the level of competition or something like that. And we actually can look at then how that is different, or it might have a different stress level than practice, because there's different demands that are being placed on the individual. Now the stress process is a little bit different. So there are some steps to the stress process. The bullet point here doesn't really give you a great amount of detail on that, but if you go to page 82 in your textbook, you'll be able to follow along with the next image. But something you need to realize about the stress process is there are some implications for how we're going to work with someone or a team dealing with how to cope with stress, or how to deal with the demands of sport and physical activity. So here's a picture. Again, this is figure 4.3 on page 82. And this is really the stress process. So first there's some environmental demand, and it could be a physical demand, it could be some sort of psychological demand. Okay, and then there's stage 2, an individual's perception of the environmental demand. So something goes on, and then we appraise that demand. So we can think of this as really like the amount of psychological or even physical threat that might be perceived by the individual. And then from those appraisals, we have a stress response. And again, this usually has some physical and psychological component, so it could lead to something like arousal. It might be state anxiety, so you might start to worry, become nervous about your performance. Muscles tend to tense up, and your attention changes, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on in this lecture. And then the last one, stage 4, are behavioral consequences. So now we've been put into a situation, we've appraised the stress that comes with that situation, we have some response, and then because of that stress, there's going to be some kind of change in our behavior. And kind of the sucky part about this is then based on your behavior, that can then further highlight some environmental demands or some source of stress, and then that tends to feed back to stage 1, and we go back through the entire process. So stress and anxiety can really derail someone's performance in sport. And so what are some sources of stress and anxiety? Well, we can think of situational sources, so maybe how important the event is it a tournament game, is it the state finals, whatever it might be. But what about this idea of uncertainty? What if you've never played against this person before? What if you're supposed to be winning this game and you're not? And that can cause some kind of stress. Some unforeseen thing could really impose some physical and psychological stress on the athlete. And then we can think of personal sources. So we kind of already talked about trait anxiety. So if the person is kind of a highly anxious person in the beginning, then a smaller amount of stress may derail them more easily. But we can also think of things like self-esteem. Does the individual believe they can actually efficiently perform some task? So that can definitely play a role here, because if they're not very confident in their own ability, then a stressful situation might derail or hamper their performance. And then this last one is more of a example. So we have social physique anxiety, and this SPA, as it's usually called, is really when someone feels uncomfortable in their own body. So they have body image issues. They don't think they're muscular enough, or they don't think they're thin enough, whatever it might be. And because of that, it actually causes, it's kind of this personally or self-driven source of stress, which can lead to some anxiety and in the end result hamper performance. Now, if we think about some symptoms of maybe what stress and anxiety is like for athletes, there's really a laundry list of examples. You can think of things like clammy hands, so when your hands are just sweating but they're cold. There's the nervous person who has to pee all the time or urinate a lot. There's the profuse sweating for no real reason. Negative self-talk, so this is kind of the internal monologue that just says, God, you're terrible, why are we doing this, why are you putting yourself in this situation, you're horrible at this. It could be a lot of different things. You might feel sick. The person might have cotton mouth. Now, the last one here, you could really think of your own examples, because this is going to be different for person to person. And that's important to note. I know for me, before I have a big presentation, or back when I used to play competitive sports, I used to fidget a lot. I used to get clammy hands and such. That would definitely happen. But I would fidget all the time. I just couldn't sit still. You know, it looked like I had ADD. I just couldn't stand to be just still for a moment. And everybody has their own symptoms of being overly aroused or amped up, as well as maybe anxious. So this, really don't think of this as an exhaustive list. There could definitely be some alternatives here. So now what we need to do is think about, well, how does arousal or anxiety affect performance? Does it affect performance? And really there's a bunch of different ways that we could talk about this. But first we need to think about, hey, do we think that arousal and anxiety would affect performance? And I think we've kind of made the case for that. You can see that stress triggers some responses from the individual, and there could potentially be some maladaptive outcomes in the end for a person's performance in sport. With this last bullet point, what I want you to do is really just think of an example sometime when maybe you were highly aroused or really amped up for a sport, some kind of performance, or maybe another time when you were really anxious. Did it have an effect on your own athletic or academic performance? Just think about that, and I don't think it's going to be too hard for you to think of a time when either one of those may have either heightened your performance or even hampered it. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to kind of fly through a few different ways, theories, that kind of stuff, in which arousal and anxiety have been studied and how they affect performance. So the first one's going to be drive theory. And this one's really pretty simple. So it basically says that when you have a well-learned skill, if you're highly aroused or really amped up or really anxious, so if your anxiety level goes up, your performance is going to go up. And this makes sense when we're thinking of something that's well learned, something we've done over and over and over where it's basically a habit. But there tends to be a component here that gets a bit muddy. So if you think about social facilitation theory, again, this is when others are around, when we have to do a well-learned skill or something we've done before, we tend to do better at that skill. But if it's something that's complex or something we haven't done before, a novel skill, having people around actually leads to lower performance. So we can see that anxiety kind of in the drive theory predictions, it kind of goes both ways here, and it's not too clear. But if we think of something like the inverted U hypothesis, this one is a little bit easier to digest. So what we've got here is on the y-axis, we've got performance, so low performance, high performance, and then on the x-axis we have, again, low physiological arousal, and then high physiological arousal. And what you can kind of think of here is this suggests that athletes or physical activity participants, if they have no physiological arousal, they're not amped up, their performance will be low. Okay? But the more and more they become aroused, so kind of like drive theory, we're going to see their performance go up, 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 up. But at some point, okay, when they become more and more physiologically aroused, their performance actually starts to come back down. So this is when they actually go a little bit overboard and get too amped up. And this is kind of hard to tailor to every athlete, because this point, this progression from low into this high performing kind of middle state or mid state of physiological arousal is hard to identify. Now the next one kind of gets at that. So how do we tailor this for each individual? And that's when we start talking about the eyes off, or individual zones of optimal functioning. Okay, so what this states is basically for different athletes. So we have athlete A, B, and C. Okay, someone with a low eyes off is going to be in their excuse me, in the zone, if you will, so their best performance at kind of a low state anxiety. Okay, but if they go beyond anything, if they get too amped up, they're out of the zone. Their performance is not going to be optimal or high. Okay. Then there's other athletes that have kind of a different point, right? So maybe they're kind of sitting in the middle. If they don't have enough arousal, if they're not amped up enough, then they're not really going to perform very well. There's kind of a sweet spot, and then if they get too highly aroused or the anxiety level's too high, then again they're out of the zone. So this one's going to probably follow something like the inverted U. And then athlete C here, they kind of need to be really amped up. This is a person who's, really needs that situationally. They need the screaming music. They need someone in their face. They need the crowd cheering, everything. And that's when they're going to get into their best performance. Now this next one's a little bit different. So we have the catastrophe theory, and there's really two graphs to this, and this is in your book as well. But as you can see here, when cognitive anxiety, so when you're worrying, when that is low, we tend to see a usual or a typical inverted U progression here, where performance is going to be low if there isn't much physiological arousal. So again, nothing that new here, but again, this is when worry or low cognitive anxiety exists. So what happens when there's high cognitive anxiety? Well, what we tend to see is, again, it begins to follow the same trajectories as our inverted U. But when something goes wrong, okay, all of a sudden the person's performance goes completely awry. Okay, so you can usually think of someone when they really just hit the wall and their performance just kind of goes out the window. It's not very common for someone to just bounce back immediately. There's usually a pretty long progression for the person to go back before they can get back to this high level of performance. Now what's important to note here, though, is even in this catastrophe scenario with the high worry, notice that the performance here, kind of the apex here of this graph, is higher than it is when there's no worry. Okay, and that's important to note, and it's good to know that worry, while we usually think of being worrisome or something like that as a bad thing, it could actually cause us to really highly value our performance or really try harder and motivate us. That's the end of part 1 for chapter 4. Make sure you take some time and move on to the next part of the lecture.